A cheerleader, a rising star full of dreams, her life taken in a place she should have felt safest, right next to the field she once proudly performed on. It was 6:30 a.m. on January 15, 2024, when the body was discovered. The athlete field, usually filled with the sounds of running feet, laughter, and the adrenaline of youthful ambition, stood silent. Too silent. A thick, uneasy stillness hung in the air as the first rays of daylight cast long shadows across the cold ground. There, in the early morning mist, lay the lifeless body of 19-year-old Zoria Williams, her cheerleading uniform stained by something far darker than sweat. What led to this tragic end? What was it that turned a bright future into a silent death on the grass? It wasn't just the location that seemed wrong. It was too familiar. A place of comfort, of competition, of camaraderie. And yet, as her body lay there, cold and motionless, everything about it screamed of something off. But why? The body was found not far from the house of someone she trusted. Someone she had turned to when everything around her felt like it was crumbling. A coach. A mentor. A protector. This was a carefully orchestrated tragedy. A chain of events stretching months, even years, that led to this very moment. A betrayal that had been hidden beneath layers of trust and respect. Who could have predicted that the very person she trusted the most could be the one who would destroy her? Her body, once full of life and energy, lay as a stark reminder that not all is as it seems. This was only the beginning. What had happened? Was this just the final, horrifying act of a bigger story? Or was this the culmination of years of hidden pain? Zoria Williams, one of the brightest stars on her cheerleading team, was gone. But what led to her downfall? And who else would be caught in the web of secrets she had unknowingly become entangled in? The answers weren't as simple as they seemed. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss a story that dives deep into the truth. We've got more coming your way, and we wouldn't want you to miss it. The investigation begins. A scene like this raises too many questions. The nature of the injury, the positioning of the body, the way she had been found, none of it made sense. But for the investigators, one thing stood out immediately. Zoria had been here before. She knew this place. She had trusted this place. And it wasn't the first time she had been here. The team she had once stood alongside, the coach who had once been her confidant. These were the people who knew her. Yet, somehow, they were the last ones to notice something had gone terribly wrong. Was this her choice? Or had something pushed her to this point? As the investigators combed through the scene, one name began to surface over and over again. Coach Isaiah Walker. He had been Zoria's mentor, her guide, someone she had trusted. But as the pieces began to come together, it became apparent that the relationship between Zoria and Coach Walker wasn't as simple as it seemed. Zoria had come to this school not just for the education, but for the sense of family. She had found it on the cheerleading team. But there was more beneath the surface, hidden, uncomfortable truths that would soon start to surface. It was here, on this very field, that Zoria had first met Coach Walker, a trusted figure who had taken her under his wing. He seemed like the perfect mentor, someone who championed not just athleticism but also the importance of mental well-being for his players. He even went so far as to offer advice and support to LGBTQ+ youth, a cause that many admired him for. But was his support genuine? Or was it something more? The deeper the investigators dug, the more questions arose. There were whispers about Zoria's transformation. Her decision to transition had come with its own set of challenges, but it was clear she had leaned heavily on Coach Walker for support. But was that support purely for her emotional and psychological well-being? Or had there been darker motives lurking beneath his guidance? Zoria had come to this school, leaving behind a broken family. Her mother, absent. Her father, distant. It was here that she found not just friendship, but a refuge. A refuge, she thought, in a coach who had promised to help her succeed in everything she dreamed of. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that trust, once broken, would cost her everything. The local police station buzzed with activity. It was 9:30 a.m. on January 16, 2024, just one day after Zoria Williams' body had been found. The steady hum of urgency filled the air as detectives moved quickly from one room to another, reviewing notes, re-interviewing witnesses, and sifting through the initial clues. It was clear from the moment Zoria's body had been discovered that this wasn't an ordinary case. This was something more, something far more complex than they had initially anticipated. Inside the forensic lab, the body lay under harsh white lights, its once vibrant cheerleading uniform now a grim reminder of a life cut short. The medical examiner, Dr. Lisa Monroe, carefully examined the scene of death. Her gloved hands methodically traced the marks left on Zoria's body. The cause of death was evident, blunt force trauma to the head, but there was more to it. The positioning of her body, the strange angles at which her limbs were placed. It wasn't just a simple murder. It felt as though someone had carefully staged this, perhaps as a message. "We'll need a more thorough analysis," Dr. Monroe muttered to herself, glancing at the detectives nearby. The way her body is arranged, it suggests something more personal, like the killer was trying to send a message. Outside, the team of investigators began to canvass the area near the athlete field, combing for evidence. The surrounding woods, once a quiet backdrop to the energetic practices, now held an unsettling stillness. Officers took photographs, collected footprints, and noted any unusual objects. There was something off about the way everything was laid out. The sense of familiarity, yes, but there was also an unnatural quality to it, a sense that the place had been manipulated. The field itself, just a stone's throw from Coach Isaiah Walker's house, stood silent under a cold, gray sky. The cheerleading squad had trained here countless times before, but today the air was thick with tension. Every corner of the space seemed to whisper of secrets hidden beneath the surface, and Zoria, once a familiar face, had now become the center of a mystery. Zoria had been a regular here, someone who had given everything for the team, but her final days had been clouded by something. She hadn't just come to cheerleading practice to perfect her routines, she'd been hiding something. Her smile, once genuine and carefree, had started to seem forced. The enthusiasm she had once brought to every practice had slowly turned to distraction. Her teammates noticed it. Her friends noticed it, but no one had thought to ask why. No one had dared to dig deeper. Then there was the coach. Isaiah Walker was a name that came up repeatedly. He was more than just a coach to his athletes. He was a mentor, a protector. At least, that's what he had always presented himself as. He had long been the father figure for many of the athletes on the cheerleading squad, particularly for those who had felt alone. Zoria, who had come from a broken family, had clung to his support. But in the wake of her death, the investigators were starting to question just how genuine that support had been. There were whispers, small, subtle signs. Zoria had often spent more time with Coach Walker than any other teammate. Texts had been exchanged late into the night. Conversations had been carried out behind closed doors. Some witnesses even reported seeing Zoria look uncomfortable after certain private meetings. But could this really mean something more? Or was it simply the misunderstanding of a troubled relationship? Detective Adam Grant stood by the window of the station, his hand on the cold glass, staring out into the dreary morning. The clock read 10:15 a.m. He had spent the last few hours sifting through the testimonies of Zoria's teammates and friends. Many spoke of a sudden withdrawal in the days leading up to her death. They described her as distant, not herself. Some even recalled her having strange interactions with Coach Walker during practice. Could it be that he had taken advantage of her vulnerability? But the biggest question that lingered in the air was the one no one dared to speak aloud. Was Coach Walker involved in her death? Or was he a victim of circumstances, caught in a situation far beyond his control? Was there something hidden beneath his public persona? The more Detective Grant thought about it, the more unsure he became. The flashbacks started to surface in his mind. He pictured Zoria in the last few days before her death, her eyes haunted, her voice distant. The late-night conversations she'd had with Coach Walker that the team couldn't quite hear. She had seemed troubled, yes, but also determined. Had she found something? A secret? Something she was afraid to reveal? The investigation moved into the next phase, digging into Zoria's past, her struggles, and the complex relationship with her coach. It wasn't just the immediate clues they needed to consider. It was everything that had led up to this moment. The more they uncovered, the more they began to realize that Zoria's death was far from random. Her journey had been riddled with emotional turmoil, hidden traumas, and, perhaps, a dangerous loyalty to the wrong person. A series of interviews had begun, and the inconsistencies in the statements given by those closest to Zoria were starting to stand out. Her teammates recalled strange moments. One described a private conversation with Zoria, where she had admitted she was afraid to go home. Another teammate remembered seeing Zoria's sudden discomfort during a meeting with Coach Walker. Something in the way she tensed up, as though she were trying to mask something she couldn't explain. Still, none of them could have known what was really happening behind closed doors. As the investigation continued, Detective Grant found himself reflecting on the strange behavior he had been told about. Zoria had become withdrawn, not just from her teammates, but from the world around her. She had stopped talking about her hopes, her future. The fire that had once burned so brightly within her seemed to have flickered out. And the more they dug into her history, the more it became clear that this wasn't just a case of a troubled teen in need of guidance. No, Zoria had been hiding something far more dangerous. But what? And why did she feel the need to conceal it? Was it out of fear? Or was it something more complicated? Something that, like the dark, haunted corners of the field, no one could fully see? The investigation had just begun. But already, the detectives knew, the truth was buried deeper than they could have ever imagined. Zoria's apartment sat on the edge of campus, a stark contrast to the bustling dormitories around it. The date was January 14, 2024, 2 days before her body would be discovered on the athlete field. It was late morning, around 11 a.m., when Detective Adam Grant visited the small, sparsely furnished space. The apartment, though simple, held traces of a young woman who had tried, in every way she could, to create a sense of home. The walls were lined with a few photographs, most of them from college events, snapshots of her life before it had taken a darker turn. The cheerleading competitions, the school plays, a smiling Zoria in her college uniform. These images felt like ghosts of a happier time. A small collection of books sat on the windowsill, their spines worn from constant use, a testament to her need to escape into stories when reality became too difficult. But it was the framed photos of Zoria with her roommates, especially one where she was surrounded by a group of friends, smiling and carefree, that made the apartment feel like a life she had desperately tried to belong to, but had never fully claimed. It was clear, Zoria had always felt like an outsider. She had been a cheerleader, an athlete, someone who was supposed to fit into the world around her. But behind the perfect smiles and vibrant uniforms, she had been struggling, wrestling with an identity that she hadn't quite come to terms with, and with a family that couldn't understand her. Her parents had never been supportive of her transition. Their rejection was silent, but it spoke volumes. From a young age, Zoria had been told, without words, that she wasn't welcome in the home they had built. She was different, too different for their small, tightly knit world. They had tried to love her, but only on their terms. When Zoria made the decision to become a trans woman, her world fractured. Her mother cried. Her father, stoic and distant, said nothing. The tension in their house grew unbearable until Zoria, in a mix of desperation and hope, left for good. She moved into a small apartment just a few blocks from campus, away from the pain that filled her childhood home. It was here that Zoria had found something resembling comfort. Her roommate, Kira, a fellow student who had once been a cheerleader herself, had taken Zoria in when she had nowhere else to go. Kira wasn't just a roommate. She was a mentor, a confidant, someone Zoria had come to trust deeply. Kira had encouraged Zoria to embrace her true self, to stop hiding and to let her transformation shine. And for a time, it seemed like Kira's advice was all Zoria needed. She blossomed under her influence, becoming more confident, more outspoken. It was as if Zoria had found her own voice for the first time. But as Zoria's confidence grew, so did the cracks in her relationships. What she didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that Kira's advice wasn't all it seemed. Kira had her own set of troubles, her own demons, and some of them may have been the very thing that led Zoria down a darker path. On January 15, 2024, just hours before the body would be found, Detective Grant met with Kira at a coffee shop near the campus. Kira's voice trembled as she recounted her time living with Zoria. Zoria, she wanted to be seen. She didn't want to hide anymore. I think she thought that if she could just change, if she could just be who she was meant to be, everything would fall into place. Kira paused, her eyes downcast, the weight of her words hanging in the air. But sometimes, you trust people you shouldn't. I think she trusted me too much. And I think that trust led her into things she wasn't ready for. But Kira wasn't the only one who had witnessed Zoria's transformation. There were others, her cheerleading teammates, her classmates, who saw both the strength and vulnerability of the young woman she had become. To many, Zoria was the symbol of courage, the one who had the courage to face the world on her own terms. She had finally embraced who she was, casting off the fears and doubts that had once held her back. But beneath that newfound confidence lay a girl who was still searching for acceptance, still searching for a family that had never truly existed. Tanya, one of Zoria's teammates, had been at practice just days before Zoria's death. She was always there, always putting on a brave face, Tanya recalled, her voice catching in her throat. But she was struggling. You could see it. She'd talk about her family, how they wouldn't accept her, how she wished they could just love her the way she was. Tanya paused, the pain of those memories still fresh. But she wasn't just struggling with her family. You know? She was struggling with who she was becoming, who she had to be to make it in this world. And I think, somewhere along the way, she started to doubt if she was worth being loved at all. Zoria's journey wasn't just about discovering her identity. It was about the constant search for belonging. In the months leading up to her death, it seemed as though she had tried to fill that emptiness with the wrong people. Her relationship with Coach Isaiah Walker had become one of the most complicated aspects of her life. Was he the father figure she had longed for? Or was he just another person who manipulated her need for affection? Her involvement with him, in the weeks leading up to her tragic end, was a subject still under investigation. But one thing was clear, Zoria had trusted too easily. In her final days, Zoria had seemed at peace with herself, on the surface. But the cracks were there, hidden beneath the facade. The text messages between her and Coach Walker had grown increasingly personal, crossing boundaries that no coach should ever cross with an athlete. Had she misinterpreted the relationship? Had she been too trusting, too naive? It was these unanswered questions that haunted Detective Grant. Zoria had been a victim of more than just a brutal crime. She had been a victim of her own search for love, for acceptance, for a place in a world that seemed determined to reject her. And now, as the investigation delved deeper into her life, the question remained, was Zoria simply too trusting of the people around her? Had her longing for love clouded her judgment, leading her down a path of danger? Zoria's story was far from over. And yet, the more they uncovered, the more the investigators found themselves confronting an uncomfortable truth. Zoria's tragedy had been written long before the final, fateful day on that athlete field. But the question still hung in the air. Who was truly to blame? And could Zoria have been saved before it was too late? The investigation was only beginning to reveal the layers of her life. But already, it was clear that the answers were more complex than anyone had ever imagined. It was 1:30 p.m. on January 16, 2024, the day after Zoria's body was discovered. Detective Adam Grant stood in front of Coach Isaiah Walker's house, a large suburban home tucked into a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. From the outside, it looked like a place of safety, stability, and success. The neatly manicured lawn, the warm beige siding, the polished black mailbox, all reflected a life built on the kind of public image that Walker had worked so hard to maintain. Grant couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that there was more lurking behind the facade. Isaiah Walker had been a trusted figure on the cheerleading squad for nearly a decade. Known for his firm but nurturing coaching style, he had gained the loyalty of countless athletes, especially those who felt alienated, vulnerable, or overlooked. His public persona was one of a mentor, a father figure, a man who went above and beyond to help LGBTQ+ youth find acceptance in an often unforgiving world. He had been celebrated for advocating for trans athletes and for creating a space where they could express themselves freely without judgment. The media had often praised his compassion, painting him as a hero of sorts, a beacon of hope for the LGBTQ+ community. But the more Detective Grant learned, the more that image seemed like a carefully crafted lie. Walker's ability to build trust with his athletes was impressive, even manipulative. He made them feel like they were the most important thing in the world. Yet, beneath this surface of benevolence, there were whispers, subtle, unspoken rumors about his behavior. Zoria had been one of those who trusted him most. Walking into the coach's house, Detective Grant was struck by how meticulous everything appeared, everything in its place, as if to further cultivate the illusion of a perfect life. As Grant explored the house, he could feel the weight of the deception pressing down on him. In the living room, a collection of team photos lined the walls, showcasing moments of victory and togetherness. There were framed pictures of Coach Walker with various athletes. Some had their arms draped over him, others were looking up at him with expressions of admiration. One photo caught Grant's eye. It was a shot from a team event, the cheerleading squad posing in their uniforms with Walker standing proudly in the center. Zoria stood beside him, her smile forced but her eyes oddly distant, as if she had known something others didn't. The more Grant dug into Walker's relationship with Zoria, the clearer the disturbing pattern became. The texts between the coach and the athlete weren't just about coaching or practice schedules. They were deeply personal. Late-night exchanges that carried an almost intimate tone, things a coach should never say to his athlete. Comments that blurred the line between mentor and something darker. Zoria's teammates recalled seeing the two of them together frequently, both at practice and outside of it. Conversations that lingered in the corners of the gym, meetings after hours. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like a special bond between a coach and his most dedicated student. But as the investigation unraveled, the chilling truth began to surface. She was always seeking his approval. One of the teammates confided in Grant. I think he knew that. She wanted to belong somewhere. And I think he used that. But it wasn't just Zoria. Grant's investigation revealed that this wasn't the first time Coach Walker had crossed boundaries with a student. The subtle tactics he employed to gain trust, the way he made his athletes feel like they owed him their loyalty, it was a pattern. Several former students had come forward anonymously, each recounting similar stories of emotional manipulation, of blurred lines, of relationships that began with encouragement but slowly became controlling. One former athlete, Tanya, had said something that sent a chill through Grant. He knew how to make you feel like you were the only one that mattered. He would say, "You're special. You're different. I understand you like no one else." It felt good at first, but later, it felt suffocating. As the days passed, Grant's suspicions deepened. He found evidence of other athletes, younger girls who had been in Coach Walker's inner circle, and he couldn't ignore the uncomfortable parallels. What had started as mentorship appeared to have devolved into something far darker. The breakthrough came when Grant spoke to a former assistant coach, Mike Davies, who had worked with Walker for several years. Mike had left the team shortly before Zoria's death, but his insights were invaluable. He confirmed something that had been nagging at Grant. He could be a great guy when he wanted to be. But when it came to his athletes, he didn't see them as people. He saw them as trophies, objects to possess. Mike's voice dropped to a whisper. I left because I couldn't watch him destroy those girls. I had to get out. Grant felt a surge of both anger and disbelief. Isaiah Walker had spent years cultivating an image as a protector of the marginalized, only to exploit his position for personal gain. The betrayal ran deeper than he could have imagined. As the investigation moved forward, Detective Grant began to piece together the dark truth about Coach Walker's secret life. He had been playing a dangerous game, manipulating the very people who had trusted him most. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became. Walker's relationships with his athletes were not simply those of a coach and his team. They were deeply entangled with manipulation, control, and the exploitation of vulnerable individuals who sought acceptance. Grant's mind raced as he discovered more disturbing evidence. The key moment came when he found a hidden journal in Walker's study. It was filled with handwritten notes, some of which were dedicated to his athletes, including Zoria. The tone of the entries was chilling. Walker had written about shaping his athletes, about their need for him, about the ways he had made them depend on his guidance. There were cryptic references to the special bond he shared with his best athletes. But what really sent a shiver down Grant's spine was the last entry. It was dated January 12, 2024, just 3 days before Zoria's death. I've almost got her. She's mine. And no one will stop me now. Grant's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this wasn't just about an inappropriate relationship. This was manipulation, exploitation, and possibly murder. But how deep did Walker's betrayal go? And how much longer would it take before the full scope of his actions was exposed? As Grant left Walker's house, his mind raced with the implications. Was the coach's manipulative grip on his athletes the true cause of Zoria's tragic end? Or had the relationship gone even further than anyone had imagined? The police station was a flurry of activity as investigators dug deeper into the case, piecing together the trail left behind by Zoria's final days. The time was 1:15 p.m. on Thursday, April 13th, nearly 72 hours after Zoria's body had been discovered. But the weight of her death still hung heavily in the air. In Detective Adam Grant's office, the walls lined with case files and photos of Zoria's teammates and acquaintances, the search for truth seemed endless. The investigation was far from over, but they were starting to see a clearer picture. A team of forensic experts had been sifting through the messages found on Zoria's phone, uncovering text exchanges that were unsettling to say the least. Zoria, once a bright and confident young woman, had appeared increasingly distressed in the days before her death. The tone of the conversations with Coach Isaiah Walker had shifted from mentorship to something far more personal. Messages that started as words of encouragement turned into questions about her personal life, her fears, her body, and her relationships. There were moments of genuine concern, but they became layered with inappropriate comments, ones that no coach should ever make. One message, sent just a week before her death, read, "I want to be there for you, Zoria, not just as your coach, but as someone who understands you, all of you." There was something deeply unsettling about the phrasing. Was it mentorship? Or was it manipulation? Zoria had often confided in Coach Walker, but now, with the clarity of hindsight, those confessions seemed more like bait, a way to lure her deeper into his control. Detective Grant was certain that Coach Walker wasn't just the caring mentor he appeared to be. He was hiding something more dangerous than anyone had imagined. As investigators began sifting through hidden footage from the security cameras near the coach's house, they found images that left no room for doubt. In the footage from the night of April 10th, just days before Zoria's body was discovered, she could be seen leaving Coach Walker's house, visibly upset. Her body language told a different story than the one he had spun for the police. She wasn't just a student visiting her mentor. She was leaving a scene that seemed charged with tension. The footage was damning. It showed Zoria walking away quickly, head down, hands clasped tightly in front of her. What had happened behind those closed doors? The footage alone didn't answer that question, but it raised enough suspicion for the police to start digging deeper into Walker's past. They found a woman named Tamara Harris, a former cheerleader who had been on the squad years earlier. In an interview at the station, her voice trembled as she recalled her own experience with Coach Walker. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," Tamara confessed. "He's so charming, so nice. But there were moments when he crossed the line. He'd give me little compliments, touch my shoulder, ask if I was okay. At first, it seemed innocent. But then he'd start talking about things I wasn't ready for, things no coach should ever talk about with a student." Tamara had been a victim, too. Her story had mirrored Zoria's in some ways. She had been vulnerable, searching for validation in a world that seemed to reject her. Walker had taken advantage of that vulnerability, subtly crossing boundaries with every interaction until it was too late to take it back. And just like Zoria, Tamara had been left with the aftermath of confusion and guilt. She had never spoken up, though. Who would believe her against a respected coach, a man who championed LGBTQ+ rights and who had earned the trust of every athlete he mentored? But now, the truth was starting to surface. And as more women came forward, the walls around Coach Walker's carefully constructed persona began to crumble. Detective Grant was piecing the story together like a puzzle, each new revelation bringing him closer to understanding the full scope of the coach's manipulation. But as the case began to unfold, something even darker loomed over the investigation. Was Walker the only perpetrator? Or was there more to this web of deceit? Perhaps other victims, other people who had been entangled in his abuse of power? The legal team at the station worked tirelessly to build a case against Coach Walker. They began pulling together testimonies, security footage, and phone records, linking him not only to Zoria's tragic death but to a pattern of predatory behavior that spanned years. Yet even as the case strengthened, there was a sense of urgency. The coach had already begun to cover his tracks. Calls had been deleted from his phone. Witnesses who could have corroborated the stories had started to forget what they had seen. It was clear that Walker had been preparing for this moment, erasing anything that could be used against him. The question was, would the investigators be able to uncover the truth before he could escape? Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss a story that dives deep into the truth. We've got more coming your way. and we wouldn't want you to miss it. But even with the mounting evidence, the most difficult part of the investigation was still ahead. The deeper they dug, the more complex the case became. Walker wasn't just a coach anymore. He had become a symbol of something far more insidious. An individual who used trust, power, and the guise of mentorship to manipulate vulnerable young people. And the question that hung in the air was, how deep did this betrayal go? How many victims had there been before Zoria? Detective Grant felt the weight of it all as he stared at the case files, the pieces of the puzzle slowly falling into place. But he knew that time was running out. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't act fast, the truth might slip through their fingers forever. In the next room, an investigator sat hunched over a pile of new witness testimonies. There was a sense of hope in the air, but it was mixed with dread, the kind of dread that comes when you realize that what you're about to uncover might change everything. The question was no longer if Coach Walker had crossed the line. It was, how far had he gone? And who else might be waiting in the shadows? The coach's office was quiet, save for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. It was late, nearly 11 p.m. on April 8th, and the training facility was dark, with only a few straggling athletes wrapping up their late-night workouts. In the stillness of the room, Isaiah Walker sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled in front of him, staring out the window. His mind was racing, as if he could still feel the weight of Zoria's troubled eyes on him, even though she had left hours ago. The door to his office creaked open, and Zoria walked in, her eyes red-rimmed, shoulders slumped. She was carrying her cheerleading bag, but she had long since shed the bright, spirited exterior she had once worn so easily. Now, she seemed smaller, fragile even, as if she were carrying the weight of something heavy. "I didn't know where else to go," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper as she stepped into the room. Isaiah stood up immediately, his face masking the careful balance of empathy and something darker. "You can always come to me," he said, his tone warm and reassuring. But there was something more in it, something that Zoria might not have noticed at first, but would feel later. She walked toward the desk, hesitating, before dropping the bag on the floor. Her eyes flickered over to the small clock on the wall. It was already past midnight. "I just needed to talk," she murmured, avoiding his gaze. Isaiah nodded, his gaze lingering just a moment longer than necessary before he gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Of course. Sit down. What's on your mind?" As she sat, Zoria's hands fidgeted with the strap of her bag. Her internal conflict was palpable. She had always trusted Coach Walker, but tonight, for some reason, the lines between him being a mentor and something else felt blurred. He was the one person who seemed to understand her, who had been there for her when her own parents rejected her. But something felt wrong. "I don't know if I'm doing this right," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Everything, it's so much. The team, the transition, my parents. I thought I'd be happier by now." Isaiah leaned forward, his gaze softening. "Zoria, you've come so far. You're stronger than you think. You're not just a cheerleader. You're a fighter. I see that in you." Her heart fluttered at his words, a sense of validation swelling in her chest. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that her transformation could be something beautiful. But deep down, she felt like she was living a lie, living for others and not for herself. Isaiah's voice softened even more, as if coaxing her into something deeper. "You know, I can help you. I've been through tough times too. I've helped a lot of people who felt like they had no one. I've been there." Zoria looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to process his words. There was a warmth to his voice, but it felt too intense, too personal. "I don't know, Coach," she said, her words trailing off as she fought with a mix of gratitude and discomfort building inside her. His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering. "It's okay. You don't have to hide from me. I understand you more than anyone. Sometimes, it's about taking that next step, trusting someone who truly gets it." She felt a flutter in her stomach, not entirely sure whether it was because of the trust he offered or the way he said it, too deliberately. Something in her gut told her this was not just about offering help. But in that moment, she didn't know how to pull away from it. He was the first person who had ever truly seen her, not just as a cheerleader, but as Zoria. The girl behind the uniform, the girl who had fought so hard to belong. The memory of the late-night meeting lingered in Zoria's mind as the days passed. It was the first time she truly questioned whether their bond was something more than just mentorship. As the coach's behavior continued to cross subtle boundaries, encouraging late-night conversations, suggesting private meetings after practice, she began to feel trapped. She was grateful, yet torn. Isaiah had promised to help her, to show her a world where she could finally be herself. But at what cost? As more secret meetings followed, the line between emotional support and manipulation became more indistinct. Isaiah's affection felt genuine at times, but then his words would turn to compliments that seemed too personal, too intimate for someone in a position of authority. One night, when they sat alone after everyone else had gone home, he placed his hand on her shoulder. Just a touch, at first, but it lingered. Zoria tensed, unsure whether to move away or stay still. She didn't want to lose him, didn't want to be alone again. But something inside her whispered that she was crossing a dangerous line. But it wasn't just Zoria. As the flashbacks played out in her mind, she realized that the same dynamic had unfolded with other students, other athletes who trusted Isaiah. He had carefully built relationships with them, created a sense of emotional dependency. With each new encounter, the coach had ensured that the line was blurred, leading his students to believe that they couldn't make it without him. Tamara, who had once been one of his star athletes, had experienced the same pattern. She had trusted him, too, believing that his support was what she needed to succeed. But the same manipulation she had experienced now haunted Zoria's every thought. Isaiah's pattern was becoming clearer, more dangerous. He knew how to prey on the vulnerable, how to make them feel seen and understood, just enough to control them. And as Zoria's internal struggle deepened, she began to wonder, was she complicit? Had she allowed herself to be manipulated because she was desperate to belong, to be loved? Her mind raced as she replayed those late-night meetings. The ones that felt like salvation at the time, but now seemed like the start of something far darker. As the flashbacks continued, the weight of her trust in Coach Walker grew heavier. Would she have been able to break free if things had gone differently? Or had she been too far gone already? In the quiet of her apartment, with the echoes of his words still ringing in her ears, she realized that it wasn't just her life that was at stake. It was the lives of others who had fallen victim to the same pattern. And as the investigation continued, Zoria's tragic end was only the beginning of a much larger, much darker story. The team's locker room, typically a place of shared laughter and camaraderie, felt colder than ever. The atmosphere was thick with tension, each cheerleader processing the revelation in their own way. It was early in the afternoon on a Tuesday, February 21st, 2024, and the team had just finished a grueling practice session. But no one could focus on the routines. Not after the news had broken. Zoria's affair with Coach Walker had come to light in the most public way possible, via a leaked text message that had found its way into the hands of the team captain, Tasha. The message was explicit, the conversation between Zoria and Coach Walker too intimate to ignore. As the details spread like wildfire, the team went from confusion to betrayal within seconds. The coach they'd trusted, the man who had seemingly been a father figure to so many, had crossed a line. No one knew exactly when it had started, but now that it was out in the open, there was no turning back. The locker room, once filled with the voices of athletes talking shop and sharing laughs, fell silent. Tasha stood at the front, clutching her phone, her face pale as she scanned the room. Behind her, Zoria's absence loomed large. She had been gone for days, nowhere to be found. The coach's office remained locked, the coach himself nowhere in sight. Tasha took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. This can't be true. I don't want to believe it. She paused, the weight of the words crashing down on her. But Zoria, she's not here. And now we know why. She trusted him. He was supposed to protect her. Tasha's voice wavered as she fought to hold back tears. For many on the team, the betrayal cut deeper than anyone expected. Coach Walker hadn't just broken an unspoken trust with Zoria. He had shattered the very core of what the team had been built on. The foundation of support, mutual respect, and shared goals was now tainted by deceit. Whispers filled the room, growing louder by the second. Cheerleaders exchanged confused glances, some with disgust, others with disbelief. But one voice cut through the chatter, Tasha's, her voice now laced with anger. I'm done pretending this is okay, she said, looking around at her teammates. We've got to do something. He's heard Zoria, and maybe others. It didn't take long before other members of the squad began to speak up. Slowly, one by one, cheerleaders who had once trusted Coach Walker began sharing their own stories. First, it was Candace, a former squad member who had quit the team months ago. She had stayed silent for so long, unwilling to confront the reality of what she had experienced. But now, with Zoria's tragic story unfolding, she found the courage to speak out. "Coach, he made me feel special." Candace's voice cracked as she spoke. "Like I was the only one who mattered. But it was never really about me. It was always about him. It felt wrong. I didn't realize it at the time. But looking back, it was like he was manipulating us." The other cheerleaders exchanged knowing looks. Candace wasn't the only one. Several others had similar experiences. Private talks with Coach Walker that crossed boundaries, that blurred the line between mentorship and something darker. Each revelation was more chilling than the last, and the room seemed to shrink as the weight of their collective betrayal settled in. In the coach's office, the mood was equally tense. Detective Grant stood in front of a whiteboard, his eyes scanning the documents pinned to it. His team had worked tirelessly to piece together the truth, and they were getting closer to uncovering the extent of the coach's manipulative tactics. He had been hiding behind the facade of a caring mentor for too long. Grant studied a new piece of evidence, a statement from another former student-athlete. Her words were damning. "He told me I had potential, but not in just cheerleading. I thought he was guiding me. But every time I tried to pull away, he pulled me back in, made me feel like I couldn't succeed without him." With every new testimony, the truth became clearer. Coach Walker had created a cycle of manipulation, using his position of power to prey on vulnerable students, particularly those who had nowhere else to turn. And Zoria, who had so desperately sought acceptance and love, had been his latest victim. Back in the locker room, as the anger and outrage grew, Tasha's voice cracked through the tension again. "We can't let him get away with this. Not this time." It was clear now. The team wasn't just facing the end of their season. They were facing the collapse of everything they had once believed in. The trust they had placed in their coach, the respect they had given him, had been betrayed in the worst way imaginable. As the cheerleaders rallied together, vowing to stand up for Zoria and for each other, the question lingered in the air. Would the team turn its back on Coach Walker for good, or would fear and manipulation continue to hold sway? The final answer wasn't clear yet, but one thing was certain. The team would never be the same again. The true cost of Coach Walker's betrayal was just beginning to unfold, and the pain from his manipulation would reverberate far beyond that locker room. But the story was far from over, and the investigation, already rife with twists and turns, had only just begun to crack open the darkest chapters of Coach Walker's life. The investigation had dragged on for weeks, but with each passing day, the truth about Coach Isaiah Walker seemed to draw closer into focus. However, in the final stages, something shifted. Just when it seemed the case was wrapping up, the coach's calculated efforts to cover his tracks began to surface, leaving investigators scrambling to adjust their strategy. On March 5, 2024, at the police station, Detective Grant stood in front of a stack of newly acquired documents, paperwork that had been altered, digital records wiped clean. Coach Walker, despite the mounting evidence against him, had been trying to erase his past. The coaching files, once meticulously kept, now contained strange gaps. Text messages between him and Zoria had been deleted from his phone. Surveillance footage from his home was mysteriously corrupted, and several crucial emails appeared to have vanished. But it wasn't enough to stop the investigation. As Grant reviewed the evidence, a pattern emerged. The coach had been systematic in his attempts to hide the truth. He had been erasing his digital footprint, wiping away everything that could potentially link him to Zoria's death. But what he didn't account for were the things that could never be erased. The testimonies, the paper trail, and the one final piece of damning evidence that had yet to come to light. In the coach's office, the team's former cheerleaders began to come forward in a tidal wave of revelations. Their stories, once fragmented and distant, now merged into a singular narrative. Coach Walker had used his position of power to manipulate and abuse his athletes, particularly those struggling with their identities, like Zoria. But despite the flood of accusations, it was clear that there was something deeper, something more dangerous hiding beneath the surface. The breaking point came during a late-night search of Coach Walker's house on March 10th. A team of forensic investigators carefully combed through the property, finding a hidden compartment in his desk. It was a small, inconspicuous drawer, one he had clearly tried to keep from view, but inside it lay the smoking gun, a collection of recordings. These were not just surveillance tapes or personal notes. They were recordings of private conversations between the coach and various athletes, including Zoria. Detective Grant stared at the tapes in disbelief. These weren't just manipulative messages. They were confessions, moments when the coach had taken advantage of his position, pushing boundaries that no mentor should ever cross. In one particularly chilling recording, Coach Walker could be heard coaxing Zoria into a private meeting, promising her success and guidance, all while subtly asserting his control over her decisions. "Remember," the voice on the tape said, "if you want to make it, you need to trust me, Zoria. I'm the one who can make it all happen for you." There was a pause. "I'm the one who believes in you." The words sent a cold shiver down Detective Grant's spine. It was clear now. Zoria had been preyed upon by someone who had carefully constructed a web of psychological manipulation. The coach had not just been a mentor, he had been a predator. As the tapes were submitted into evidence, a new twist emerged. On March 12th, the prosecution uncovered a hidden email exchange between Coach Walker and a local business owner. The email appeared innocuous at first, just a request for help in organizing an event for the cheerleaders. But upon closer inspection, it revealed something far more sinister. A transaction involving an expensive gift sent to Zoria just days before her death. The gift, a set of expensive jewelry, had been purchased under a false name. But in the digital signature on the transaction, investigators found the unmistakable trace of Walker's identity, his attempt to cover his tracks once again. The piece of jewelry was never found, but the trail led back to him, further linking him to Zoria's tragic end. By March 15th, the case was reaching its breaking point. With the tapes and the emails now in the hands of the prosecution, Detective Grant felt the weight of the investigation lift slightly. Justice seemed possible, but there was a lingering doubt. How much had Coach Walker truly covered up, and were there more secrets yet to come? The courtroom on March 20th was packed with witnesses, family members, and press, all waiting for the coach's trial to begin. The mood was tense, unsettling. Everyone knew that Coach Walker was guilty of many things, but no one could be certain just how deep his manipulation had gone. Was Zoria the only one he had hurt? Or were there more victims whose stories had yet to be told? And then, in the final hour before the trial was set to start, something unexpected happened. A new piece of evidence emerged, a letter, left anonymously in a mailbox, addressed to Detective Grant. The letter contained a cryptic message. "The truth goes deeper than you think. Look again at the one who claims to be the victim." The implications were immediate. Had the investigation missed something crucial? Was there someone else involved? Grant stood frozen for a moment, realizing that just when they thought the case had been solved, a whole new chapter was about to unfold. The truth was far from clear, and with the coach's final moments approaching, the question loomed larger than ever. Would the justice they sought be the real justice, or was there a deeper conspiracy at play? As the courtroom doors creaked open and the trial began, Detective Grant couldn't shake the feeling that the end of this case would only mark the beginning of something much darker. The aftermath of Zoria's death was far from simple. In the days following the trial, Detective Grant sat alone in his office, reviewing the final reports. The trial had been a victory in many ways. Coach Walker was convicted of multiple charges, his manipulations finally laid bare for all to see. But as Grant sat there, the weight of the case still pressed down on him. The conclusion of the trial was not a clear-cut resolution. There were too many unanswered questions, too many moral dilemmas left unresolved. As Zoria's family sat in front of the cameras for the first time, their grief was palpable. Zoria's mother, a woman whose sorrow seemed infinite, was asked about the man who had taken her daughter's life. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but there was something else behind her words. It was the complexity of grief, the guilt of a mother who had rejected her daughter, the realization that perhaps Zoria had never truly felt the love and acceptance she deserved. Zoria tried so hard to be who she was. And we, her father and I, failed her. I failed her, her mother said quietly, looking down at the floor. But what happened with Coach Walker? That wasn't something we could have stopped. It's something we never saw coming. Zoria's father, stoic as ever, added nothing at first. But after a long silence, he looked directly into the camera. I didn't want to lose her. But I never knew how to reach her, he confessed. His words seemed to echo the fractured relationship that had defined his family for years. Outside the courtroom, Zoria's teammates stood together, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion, betrayal, and anger. Tanya, one of Zoria's closest friends on the cheerleading team, spoke for the group. Zoria wasn't just our teammate, she was our sister. And we let her slip away, Tanya said, voice shaky. We all saw how much pain she was in, but none of us did enough to help. We didn't question enough, didn't push hard enough. We trusted the wrong people. Each of the cheerleaders had their own way of coping with the tragedy. Some tried to distance themselves, burying the pain in practice or academic work, trying to forget that their friend had been manipulated and murdered by someone they had all once trusted. Others were haunted by the fact that they could have done more. The guilt weighed heavily on them all, as they reflected on the manipulative dynamics within the team that had allowed Walker to thrive unchecked. The coach, once a respected figure within the community, was now a convicted felon, his life in shambles. But the questions about his own past were harder to answer. Was he a villain, or was he simply a man who had never dealt with his own unresolved trauma? His troubled childhood, his repeated pattern of taking advantage of vulnerable students, painted him as the obvious perpetrator. But some people, including his own family members, claimed that he had never fully recovered from the abuses he had endured in his youth. A close colleague of the coach's, who asked to remain anonymous, revealed to investigators that Walker had suffered significant abuse growing up. The way he operated, it wasn't just about power. He didn't know how to give love, how to receive it. He couldn't. He was so damaged from what had happened to him that he twisted everything. He really thought he was helping them, the colleague said. But he was hurting them in ways no one could see until it was too late. For Detective Grant, the realization was a haunting one. Was Walker simply a product of his past? A man doomed to repeat the cycles of abuse that had defined his life? Or was he simply a predator, taking advantage of his position to exploit vulnerable young people? The lines between victim and villain were dangerously blurred. As Grant met with the remaining victims, a chilling pattern became evident. For each person he spoke to, the story was different, but the theme was the same. The coach had carefully built trust, established relationships, and manipulated those he was supposed to protect. But did that make him irredeemable? Or was he a victim of his own history, someone who had never learned how to love or be loved properly? One of the survivors, now an adult, expressed this conflict during a private interview. I still don't know what to think of him, she said, eyes downcast. I hate him for what he did, but I also pity him, because I don't think he ever understood what real love felt like. He didn't know how to give it, so he took it. And it hurt all of us. The moral dilemma at the heart of this case had no easy answers. The court had found Coach Walker guilty. But did that really bring closure? Was justice truly served? The convictions and the sentences might have ended the case legally, but emotionally, it left an open wound in the community, in the team, and in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by Zoria's story. As Detective Grant looked back over the case, he couldn't help but wonder, could this tragedy have been prevented? Was there something that could have been done earlier? Something that could have stopped Zoria from falling into the hands of someone who had betrayed her trust so deeply? And in the midst of it all, one question remained unanswered, lingering in the air like a shadow. Was the truth we uncovered the full truth? The final scene of the investigation left Grant standing in front of a new pile of evidence. A strange letter, a new lead. There were still pieces of the puzzle missing. A sense of unease settled over him. Was there more to this story than they had yet uncovered? Something deeper? Something darker? It seemed that the deeper the investigation went, the more mysteries it unveiled, and Detective Grant knew that this story was far from over. In the days that followed, the community slowly began to heal. The memory of Zoria lived on, but so did the unanswered questions, and the lingering sense that perhaps this was just the beginning of something even more complicated. As the camera zoomed out, the last shot lingered on the empty field where Zoria had once cheered, the silence now filled with unspoken words. For the community, and for Zoria, the case was still unfolding. And somewhere in the distance, the shadows of the past were waiting to be brought to light. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss a story that dives deep into the truth. We've got more coming your way. and we wouldn't want you to miss it.